27. The Charm of Mystery. Monogamous marriage, by its very conditions, tends to break down this strangeness. It forces the two contracting parties into an intimacy that is too persistent and unmitigated. They are in contact at too many points and too steadily. By and by, all the mystery of the relation is gone, and they stand in the unsexed position of brother and sister. Thus that, quote, maximum of temptation, of which Shaw speaks, has within itself the seeds of its own decay. A husband begins by kissing a pretty girl, his wife. It is pleasant to have her so handy and so willing. He ends by making Machiavellian efforts to avoid kissing the everyday sharer of his meals, books, bath towels, pocketbooks, relatives, ambitions, secrets, malaises, and business. A proceeding about as romantic as having his boots blacked. The thing is too horribly dismal for words. Not all the native sentimentality of man can overcome the distaste and boredom that get into it. Not all the histrionic capacity of woman can attach any appearance of gusto and spontaneity to it. An estimable lady psychologist of the American Republic, Mrs. Marion Cox, in a somewhat florid book entitled Ventures into Worlds, has a sagacious essay upon this subject. She calls the essay, quote, Our Incestuous Marriage, end quote, and argues accurately that once the adventure descends to the habitual, it takes on an offensive and degrading character. The intimate approach, to give genuine joy, must be a concession, a feat of persuasion, a victory. Once it loses that character, it loses everything. Such a destructive conversion is effected by the average monogamous marriage. It breaks down all mystery and reserve, for how can mystery and reserve survive the use of the same hot water bag and a joint concern about butter and egg bills? What remains, at least on the husband's side, is esteem, the feeling one has for an amiable aunt, and confidence, the emotion evoked by a lawyer, a dentist, or a fortune-teller, and habit, the thing which makes it possible to eat the same breakfast every day and to wind up one's watch regularly and to earn a living. Mrs. Cox, if I remember her dissertation correctly, proposes to prevent this stodgy dephlogistication of marriage by interrupting its course. That is, by separating the parties now and then, so that neither will become too familiar and commonplace to the other. By this means, she argues, curiosity will be periodically revived, and there will be a chance for personality to expand a cappella, and so each reunion will have in it something of the surprise, the adventure, and the virtuous Satanry of the honeymoon. The husband will not come back to precisely the same wife that he parted from, and the wife will not welcome precisely the same husband. Even supposing them to have gone on substantially as if together, they will have gone on out of sight and hearing of each other. Thus each will find the other, to some extent at least, a stranger, and hence a bit challenging, and hence a bit charming. The scheme has merit. More, it has been tried often and with success. It is indeed a familiar observation that the happiest couples are those who are occasionally separated, and the fact has been embalmed in the trite maxim that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Perhaps not actually fonder, but at any rate more tolerant, more curious, more eager. Two difficulties, however, stand in the way of the widespread adoption of the remedy. One lies in its costliness. The average couple cannot afford a double establishment, even temporarily. The other lies in the fact that it inevitably arouses the envy and ill nature of those who cannot adopt it, and so causes a gabbling of scandal. The world invariably suspects the worst. Let man and wife separate to save their happiness from suffocation in the kitchen, the dining room, and the connubial chamber, and it will immediately conclude that the corpse is already laid out in the drawing room. 28. Woman as wife. This boredom of marriage, however, is not nearly so dangerous a menace to the institution as Mrs. Cox with evangelistic enthusiasm, permits herself to think it is. It bears most harshly upon the wife, who is almost always the more intelligent of the pair. In the case of the husband, its pains are usually lightened by that sentimentality with which men dilute the disagreeable, particularly in marriage. Moreover, the average male gets his living by such depressing devices that boredom becomes a sort of a natural state to him. A man who spends 6 or 8 hours a day acting as a teller in a bank, or sitting upon the bench of a court, or looking to the inexpressibly trivial details of some process of manufacturing, or writing imbecile articles for a newspaper, or managing a tramway, or administering ineffective medicines to stupid and uninteresting patients, a man so engaged during all his hours of labor, which means a normal typical man, is surely not one to be oppressed unduly by the dull round of domesticity. Of far more potency as a cause of connubial discord is the general inefficiency of a woman at the business of what is called keeping house, a business founded upon a complex of trivial technicalities. As I have argued at length, women are congenitally less fitted for mastering these technicalities than men. The enterprise always costs them more effort, and they are never able to reinforce mere diligent application with that obtuse enthusiasm which men commonly bring to their tawdry and childish concerns. His wife may bore him hopelessly as mistress, just as any other mistress inevitably bores a man, though surely not quickly and so painfully as a lover bores a woman. But she is not apt to bore him so badly in her other capacities. What he commonly complains about in her, in truth, is not that she tires him by her monotony, but that she tires him by her variety. Not that she is too static, but she is too dynamic. He is weary when he gets home, and asks only the dull peace of a hog in comfortable sty. This peace is broken by the greater restlessness of his wife, the fruit of her greater intellectual resilience and curiosity. But in addition to their natural incapacity, there is a reluctance based upon the deficiency in incentive, and that deficiency in incentive is due to the maudlin sentimentality with which men regard marriage. In this sentimentality lies the germ of most of the evils which beset the institution in Christendom, and particularly in the United States, where sentiment is always carried to inordinate lengths. Having abandoned the medieval concept of woman as temptress, the men of the Nordic race have revived the correlative medieval concept of woman as angel, and to bolster up that character, they have created for her a vast and growing mass of immunities, culminating of late years in the astounding doctrine that, under the contract of marriage, all the duties lie upon the man, and all the privileges appertain to the woman. In part this doctrine has been established by the intellectual emprise and audacity of woman. Bit by bit, playing upon masculine stupidity, sentimentality, and lack of strategical sense, they have formulated it, developed it, and entrenched it in custom and law. But in other part, it is the plain product of the donkeyish vanity which makes almost every man view the practical incapacity of his wife as, in some vague way, a tribute to his own high-mindedness and consideration. Whatever revolt against her immediate indolence and efficiency, his ideal is nearly always a situation in which she will figure as a magnificent drone, a sort of empress without portfolio, entirely discharged from every unpleasant labor and responsibility. 29. Marriage and the law. This was not always the case. No more than a century ago, even by American law, the most sentimental in the world, the husband was the head of the family firm, lordly and autonomous. He had authority over the purse strings, over the children, and even over his wife. He could enforce his mandates by appropriate punishment, including the corporal. His sovereignty and dignity were carefully guarded by legislation, the product of thousands of years of experience in ratiocination. He was safeguarded in his self-respect by the most elaborate and efficient devices, and they had the support of public opinion. Consider now the changes that a few short years have wrought. Today, by the laws of most American states, laws proposed in most cases by maudlin and often notoriously extravagant agitators, and passed by sentimental orgy, all of the old rights of the husband have been converted into obligations. He no longer has any control over his wife's property. She may devote its income to the family, or she may squander that income upon idle follies, and he can do nothing. She has equal authority in regulating and disposing of the children, and, in the case of infants, more than he. There is no law compelling her to do her share of the family labor. She may spend her whole time in cinema theaters or gadding about the shops as she will. She cannot be forced to perpetuate the family name if she does not want to. She cannot be attacked with masculine weapons, for example, fists and firearms, when she makes an assault with feminine weapons, for instance, snuffling, invective, and sabotage. Finally, no law penalty can be visited upon her if she fails absolutely, either deliberately or through mere incapacity, to keep the family habitat clean, the children in order, and the victuals eatable. Now view the situation of the husband. The instant he submits to marriage, his wife obtains a large and inalienable share in his property, including all he may acquire in future. In most American states, the minimum is 1/3, and failing children, 1/2. He cannot dispose of his real estate without her consent. He cannot even deprive it of her by will. She may bring up his children carelessly and idiotically, cursing them with abominable manners and poisoning their nascent minds against him, and he has no redress. She may neglect her home, gossip and lounge about all day, put impossible food upon his table, steal his small change, pry into his private papers, hand over his home to the Periplaneta Americana, accuse him falsely of preposterous adulteries, affront his friends, and lie about him to the neighbors, and he can do nothing. She may compromise his honor by indecent dressing, write letters to moving picture actors, and expose him to ridicule by going into politics, and he is helpless. Let him undertake the slightest rebellion, over and beyond mere rhetorical protest, and the whole force of the state comes down upon him. If he corrects her with the bastinado or locks her up, he is good for 6 months in jail. If he cuts off her revenues, he is incarcerated until he makes them good. And if he seeks surcease in flight, taking the children with him, he is pursued by the gendarmerie, brought back to his duties, and depicted in the public press as a scoundrelly kidnapper, fit only for the knout. In brief, she is under no legal necessity whatsoever to carry out her part of the compact at the altar of God, where he faces instant disgrace and punishment for the slightest failure to observe its last letter. For a few grave crimes of commission, true enough, she may be proceeded against. Open adultery is a recreation that is denied to her. She cannot poison her husband. She must not assault him with edged tools, or leave him altogether, or strip off her few remaining garments and go naked. But for the vastly more various and numerous crimes of omission, and in some they are more exasperating and intolerable than even overt felony, she cannot be brought to book at all. The scene I depict is American, but it will soon extend its horrors to all Protestant countries. The newly enfranchised women of every one of them cherish long programs of what they call social improvement, and practically the whole of that improvement is based upon devices for augmenting their own relative autonomy and power. The English wife of tradition, so thoroughly a femme couverte, is being displaced by a gadabout, truculent, irresponsible creature, full of strange new ideas about her rights, and strongly disinclined to submit to her husband's authority, or to devote herself honestly to the upkeep of his house, or to bear him a biological sufficiency of heirs. And the German Hausfrau, once so innocently consecrated to Kirche, Kutsch, and Kinder, is going the same way. 30. The Emancipated Housewife. What has gone on in the United States during the past 2 generations is full of lessons and warnings for the rest of the world. The American housewife of an earlier day was famous for unremitting diligence. She not only cooked, washed, and ironed, she also made shift to master such more complex arts as spinning, baking, and brewing. Her expertness, perhaps, never reached a high level, but at all events she made a gallant effort. But that was long, long ago, before the new enlightenment rescued her. Today, in her average incarnation, she is not only incompetent, a lack as I have argued rather beyond her control, she is also filled with the notion that a conscientious discharge of her few remaining duties is, in some vague way, discreditable and degrading. To call her a good cook, I dare say, was never anything but flattery. The early American cuisine was probably a fearful thing indeed. But today the flattery turns into a sort of libel, and she resents it, or, at all events, does not welcome it. I used to know an American literary man, educated on the continent, who married a woman because she had exceptional gifts in this department. Years later, at one of her dinners, a friend of her husband tried to please her by mentioning the fact to which he had always been privy. But instead of being complimented, as a man might have been told that if his wife married him because he was a good lawyer, or surgeon, or blacksmith, this unusual housekeeper, suffering a renaissance of usualness, denounced the guest as a liar, ordered him out of the house, and threatened to leave her husband. This disdain of offices that, after all, are necessary, and might as well be faced with some show of cheerfulness, takes on the character of a definite cult in the United States, and the stray woman who attends to them faithfully is laughed at as a drudge and a fool, just as she is apt to be dismissed as a brood sow. I quote literally, craving absolution for the phrase. A jury of men during the late war, on very thin patriotic grounds, jailed the author of it, if she favors her lord with viable issue. One result is the notorious villainous of American cookery, a villainousness so painful to a cultured uvula that a French hack driver, if his wife set its masterpieces before him, would brain her with his linoleum hat. To encounter a decent meal in an American home of the middle class, simple, sensibly chosen, and competently cooked, becomes almost as startling as to meet a YMCA secretary in a bordello, and a good deal rarer. Such a thing, in most of the large cities in the Republic, scarcely has any existence. If the average American husband wants a sound dinner, he must go to a restaurant to get it, just as if he wants to refresh himself with the society of charming and well-behaved children, he has to go to an orphan asylum. Only the immigrant can take his ease and invite his soul within his own house. Woman Suffrage. 31. The Crowning Victory. It is my sincere hope that nothing I have here exhibited will be mistaken by the nobility and gentry for moral indignation. No such feeling in truth is in my heart. Moral judgments, as old Friedrich used to say, are foreign to my nature. Setting aside the vast herd which shows no definite character at all, it seems to me that the minority distinguished by what is commonly regarded as an excess of sin is very much more admirable than the minority distinguished by an excess of virtue. My experience of the world has taught me that the average wine-bibber is far better fellow than the average prohibitionist, and that the average rogue is better company than the average poor drudge, and that the worst white slave trader of my acquaintance is a decenter man than the best vice crusader. In the same way I am convinced that the average woman, whatever her deficiencies, is greatly superior to the average man. The very ease with which she defies and swindles him in several capital situations of life is the clearest of proofs of her general superiority. She did not obtain her present high immunities as a gift from the gods, but only after a long and often bitter fight, and in that fight she exhibited forensic and tactical talents of a truly admirable order. There was no weakness of man that she did not penetrate and take advantage of. There was no trick that she did not put to effective use. There was no device so bold and inordinate that it daunted her. The latest and greatest fruit of this feminine talent for combat is the extensions of the suffrage, now universal in the Protestant countries, and even advancing in those of the Greek and Latin rites. This fruit was garnered, not by an attack en masse, but by a mere foray. I believe that the majority of women, for reasons that I presently expose, were not eager for the extension, and regard it as of small value today. They know that they can get what they want without going to the actual polls for it. Moreover, they are out of sympathy with the most Brummagem reforms advocated by the professional suffragists, male and female. The mere statement of the current suffragist platform, with its long list of quack sure cures for all the sorrows of the world, is enough to make them smile sadly. In particular, they are skeptical of all reforms that depend upon the mass action of immense numbers of voters, large sections of whom are wholly devoid of sense. A normal woman, indeed, no more believes in democracy in the nation than she believes in democracy at her own fireside. She knows that there must be a class to order and a class to obey, and that the two can never coalesce. Nor is she susceptible to the stock sentimentalities upon which the whole democratic process is based. This was shown very dramatically in the United States at the national election of 1920, in which the late Woodrow Wilson was brought down to colossal and ignominious defeat, the first general election in which all American women could vote. All the sentimentality of the situation was on the side of Wilson, and yet fully 3/4 of the newly enfranchised women voters voted against him. He is, despite his talents for deception, a poor popular psychologist, and so he made an inept effort to fetch the girls by tear-squeezing. Every connoisseur will remember his bathos about breaking the heart of the world. Well, very few women believe in broken hearts, and the cause is not far to seek. Practically every woman above the age of 25 has a broken heart. That is to say, she has been vastly disappointed, either by falling to nab some pretty fellow that her heart was set on, or worse, by actually nabbing him, and then discovering him to be a bounder or an imbecile, or both. Thus, walking the world with broken hearts, women know that the injury is not serious. When he pulled out the Vox Angelica stop, and began sobbing and snuffling and blowing his nose tragically, the learned doctor simply drove all the women voters into the arms of the Honorable Warren Gamaliel Harding, who was too stupid to invent any issues at all, but simply took negative advantage of the distrust aroused by his opponent. Once the women of Christendom become at ease with the use of the ballot, and get rid of the preposterous harridans who got it for them and who now seek to tell them what to do with it, they will proceed to a scotching of many of the sentimentalities which currently corrupt politics. For one thing, I believe that they will initiate measures against democracy, the worst evil of the present-day world. When they come to the matter, they will certainly not ordain the extension of the suffrage to children, criminals, and the insane. In brief, to those even more inflammable and novice than the male hinds who have enjoyed it for so long. They will try to bring about its restriction, bit by bit, to the small minority that is intelligent, agnostic, and self-possessed. Say 6 women to 1 man. Thus, out of their greater instinct for reality, they will make democracy safe for democracy. The curse of man, and the cause of nearly all his woes, is his stupendous capacity for believing the incredible. He is forever embracing delusions, and each new one is worse than all that have gone before. But where is the delusion that women cherish? I mean habitually, firmly, passionately. Who will draw up a list of propositions held and maintained by them in sober earnest that are obviously not true? I allude here, of course, to genuine women, not to suffragettes and other such pseudo-males. As for me, I should not like to undertake such a list. I know of nothing, in fact, that properly belongs to it. Women as a class believe in none of the ludicrous rights, duties, and pious obligations that men are forever gabbing about. Their superior intelligence is in no way more eloquently demonstrated than by their ironical view of all such phantasmagoria. Their habitual attitude towards men is one of aloof disdain, and their habitual attitude towards what men believe in, and get into sweats about, and bellow for, is substantially the same. It takes twice as long to convert a body of women to some new fallacy as it takes to convert a body of men, and even then they halt, hesitate, and are full of mordant criticisms. The women of Colorado had been voting for 21 years before they succumbed to prohibition sufficiently to allow the man voters of the state to adopt it. Their own majority voice was against it to the end. During the interval, the men voters of a dozen non-suffrage American states had gone shrieking to the mourners' bench. In California, enfranchised in 1911, the women rejected the dry revelation in 1914. National prohibition was adopted during the war without their votes. They did not get the franchise throughout the country until it was in the Constitution, and it is without their support today. The American man, despite his reputation for lawlessness, is actually very much afraid of the police, and in all the regions where prohibition now actually is enforced, he makes excuses for his poltroonist acceptance of it by arguing that it will do him good in the long run, or that he ought to sacrifice his private desires to the common weal. But it is almost impossible to find an American woman of any culture who is in favor of it. One and all, they are opposed to the turmoil and corruption that it involves, and resentful of the invasion of liberty underlying it. Being realists, they have no belief in any program which proposes to cure the national swinishness of men by legislation. Every normal woman believes, and quite accurately, that the average man is very much like her husband John, and she knows very well that John is a weak, silly, and knavish fellow, and that any effort to convert him into an archangel overnight is bound to come to grief. As for her view of the average creature of her own sex, it is marked by a cynicism so penetrating and so destructive that a clear statement of it would shock beyond endurance. 32. The Woman Voter. Thus, there is not the slightest chance that the enfranchised women of Protestantdom, once they become at ease in the use of the ballot, will give any heed to the ex-suffragettes who now presume to lead and instruct them in politics. Years ago, I predicted that these suffragettes, tried out by victory, would turn out to be idiots. They are now hard at work proving it. Half of them devote themselves to advocating reforms, chiefly of a sexual character, so utterly preposterous that even male politicians and newspaper editors laugh at them. The other half succumb absurdly to the blandishments of the old-time male politicians, and so enroll themselves in the great political parties. A woman who joins one of these parties simply becomes an imitation man, which is to say, a donkey. Thereafter she is nothing but an obscure cog in an ancient and creaking machine, the sole intelligible purpose of which is to maintain a horde of scoundrels in public office. Her vote is instantly set off by the vote of some sister who joins the other Camorra. Parenthetically, I may add that all the ladies to take this political immolation seem to me to be frightfully plain. I know those of England, Germany, and Scandinavia only by their portraits in the illustrated papers, but those of the United States I have studied at close range at various large political gatherings, including 2 national conventions first following the extension of the suffrage. I am surely no fastidious fellow. In fact, I prefer a certain melancholy decay in women to the loud circus wagon brilliance of youth. But I give you my word that there were not 5 women at either national convention who could have embraced me in camera without first giving me chloral. Some of the chief stateswomen on show, in fact, were so downright hideous that I felt faint every time I had to look at them. The reform-mongering suffragists seem to be equally devoid of the more caressing gifts. They may be filled with altruistic passion, but they certainly have bad complexions, and not many of them know how to dress their hair. 9/10 of them advocate reforms aimed at the alleged lubricity of the male, the single standard, medical certificates for bridegroom, birth control, and so on. The motive here, I believe, is mere rage and jealousy. The woman who is not pursued sets up the doctrine that pursuit is offensive to her sex and wants to make it a felony. No genuinely attractive woman has any such desire. She likes masculine admiration, however violently expressed, and is quite able to take care of herself. More, she is well aware that very few men are bold enough to offer it without plain invitation, and this awareness makes her extremely cynical of all women who complain of being harassed, beset, stormed, and seduced. All the more intelligent women that I know, indeed, are unanimously of the opinion that no girl in her right senses has ever been actually seduced since the world began. Whenever they hear of a case, they sympathize with the man. Yet more, the normal woman of lively charms roving about among men always tries to draw the admiration of those who are previously admired elsewhere. She prefers the professional to the amateur, and estimates her skill by the attractiveness of the huntresses who have hitherto stalked it. The iron-faced suffragist propagandist, if she gets a man at all, must get one wholly without sentimental experience. If he has any, her crude maneuvers make him laugh, and he is repelled by her lack of pulchritude and amiability. All such suffragists, save a few miraculous beauties, marry ninth-rate men when they marry at all. They have to put up with the sort of cast-offs who are almost ready to fall in love with lady physicists, embryologists, and embalmers. Fortunately for the human race, the campaigns of these indignant viragos will come to naught. Men will keep on pursuing women until hell freezes over, and women will keep luring them on. If the latter enterprise were abandoned, in fact, the whole game of love would play out, for not many men take any notice of women spontaneously. 9 men out of 10 would be quite happy, I believe, if there were no women in the world, once they had grown accustomed to the quiet. Practically all men are their happiest when they are engaged upon activities, for example, drinking, gambling, hunting, business, adventure, to which women are not ordinarily admitted. It is women who seduce them from such celibate doings. The hare postures and gyrates in front of the hound. The way to put an end to the gaudy crimes that the suffragist alarmists talk about is to shave the heads of all the pretty girls in the world, and pluck out their eyebrows, and pull out their teeth, and put them in khaki, and forbid them to wriggle on dance floors, or to wear scents, or to use lipsticks, or to roll their eyes. Reform, as usual, mistakes the fish for the fly. 33. A glance into the future. The present public prosperity of the ex-suffragists is chiefly due to the fact that the old-time male politicians, being naturally very stupid, mistake them for spokesmen for the whole body of women, and so show them politeness. But soon or late, and probably disconcertingly soon, the great mass of sensible and agnostic women will turn upon them and depose them, and thereafter the women vote will be no longer at the disposal of the bogus great thinkers and messiahs. If the suffragists continue to fill the newspapers with nonsense, once that change has been effected, it will be only as a minority sect of tolerated idiots, like the Swedenborgians, Christian Scientists, Seventh-day Adventists, and other such fanatics of today. This was the history of the extension of suffrage in all of the American states that made it before the national enfranchisement of women, and it will be repeated in the nation at large, and in Great Britain and on the continent. Women are not taken in by quackery as readily as men are. The hardness of their shell of logic makes it difficult to penetrate to their emotions. For one woman who testifies publicly that she has been cured of cancer by some swindling patent medicine, there are at least 20 masculine witnesses. Even such frauds as the favorite American elixir, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which are ostensibly remedies for specific feminine ills, anatomically impossible in the male, are chiefly swallowed, so an intelligent druggist tells me, by men. My own belief, based on elaborate inquiries and long meditation, is that the grant of the ballot to women marks the concealed but none the less real beginning of an improvement in our politics, and, in the end, in our whole theory of government. As things stand, an intelligent grappling with some of the capital problems of the Commonwealth is almost impossible. A politician normally prospers under democracy, not in proportion as his principles are sound and his honor incorruptible, but in proportion as he excels in the manufacture of sonorous phrases and the invention of imaginary perils and imaginary defenses against them. Our politics thus degenerates into a mere pursuit of hobgoblins. The male voter, a coward as well as an ass, is forever taking fright in the new one and electing some mountebank to lay it. For 100 years past, the people of the United States, the most terrible existing democratic state, have scarcely had a political campaign that was not based upon some preposterous fear, first of slavery, and then of the manumitted slave, first of capitalism, and then of communism, first of the old, and then of the novel. It is a peculiarity of women that they are not easily set off by such alarms, that they do not fall readily into such facile tumults and phobias. What starts a male meeting to snuffling and trembling most violently is precisely the thing that would cause a female meeting to sniff. What we need to ward off mobocracy and safeguard a civilized form of government is more of this sniffing. What we need, and in the end it must come, is a sniff so powerful that it will call a halt upon the navigation of the ship from the forecastle, and put a competent staff on the bridge, and lay a course that is describable in intelligible terms. The officers nominated by the male electorate in modern democracies before the extension of the suffrage were usually chosen not for their competence, but for their mere talent for idiocy. They reflected accurately the male weakness for whatever is rhetorical and sentimental and feeble and untrue. Consider, for example, what happened in the salient case. Every 4 years the male voters of the United States choose from among themselves one who was put forward as the man most fit of all resident men to be the first citizen of the Commonwealth. He was chosen after interminable discussion. His qualifications were thoroughly canvassed. Very large powers and dignities were put into his hands. Well, what did we commonly find when we examined this gentleman? We found not a profound thinker, not a leader of sound opinion, not a man of notable sense, but merely a wholesaler of notions so infantile that they must needs disgust a sentient suckling. In brief, a spouting geyser of fallacies and sentimentalities, a cataract of unsupported assumptions and hollow moralizings, a tedious phrase merchant and a platitudinarian, a fellow whose noblest flights of thought were flattered when they were called comprehensible, specifically, a Wilson, a Taft, a Roosevelt, or a Harding. This was the male champion. I do not venture upon the cruelty of comparing his bombastic flummeries to the clear reasoning of a woman of like fame and position. All I ask of you is that you weigh them for sense, for shrewdness, for intelligent grasp of obscure relation, for intellectual honesty and courage, with the ideas of the average midwife. 34. The Suffragette. I have spoken with some disdain of the suffragette. What is the matter with her, fundamentally, is simple. She is a woman who has stupidly carried her envy of certain of the superficial privileges of men to such a point that it takes on the character of an obsession, and makes her blind to their valueless and often chiefly imaginary character. In particular, she centers this frenzy of hers upon one definitive privilege, to wit, the alleged privilege of promiscuity in amour, the modern droit de seigneur. Read the books of the chief lady Savonarolas, and you will find running through them a hysterical denunciation of what is called the double standard of morality. There is, indeed, a whole literature devoted exclusively to it. The existence of this double standard seems to drive the poor girls half frantic. They bellow raucously for its abrogation and demand that the frivolous male be visited with even more idiotic penalties than those which now visit the aberrant female. Some even advocate gravely his mutilation by surgery, that he may be forced into rectitude by a physical disability for sin. All this, of course, is hocus pocus, and the judicious are not deceived by it for an instant. What these virtuous beldames actually desire in their hearts is not that the male be reduced to chemical purity, but that the franchise of dalliance be extended to themselves. The most elementary acquaintance with Freudian psychology exposes their secret animus. Unable to ensnare males under the present system, or at all events unable to ensnare males sufficiently appetizing to arouse the envy of other women, they leap to the theory that it would be easier if the rules were less exacting. This theory exposes their deficiency in the chief character of their sex, accurate observation. The fact is that, even if they possessed the freedom that men are supposed to possess, they would still find it difficult to achieve their ambition, for the average man, whatever his stupidity, is at least keen enough in judgment to prefer a single wink from a genuinely attractive woman to the last delirious favors of the typical suffragette. Thus the theory of the whoopers and snorters of the cause, in its esoteric as well as in its public aspect, is unsound. They are simply women who, in their tastes and processes of mind, are two-thirds men, and the fact explains their failure to achieve presentable husbands, or even consolatory betrayal, quite as effectively as it explains the ready credence they give political and philosophical absurdities. 35. A mythical daredevil. The truth is that the picture of male carnality that such women conjure up belongs almost wholly to fable, as I have already observed in dealing with the sophistries of Dr. Eliza Burt Gamble, a parologist on a somewhat higher plane. As they depict him in their fevered treatises on illegitimacy, white slave trading, and ophthalmia neonatorum, the average male adult of the Christian and cultured countries leads a life of gaudy lubricity, rolling magnificently from one liaison to another, and with an almost endless queue of ruined milliners, dancers, chairwomen, parlor maids, and waitresses behind him, all dying of poison and despair. The life of man, as these furiously envious ones see it, is the life of a leading actor in a boulevard revue. He is a polygamous, multigamous, myriadigamous, an insatiable and unconscionable debauchee, a monster of promiscuity, prodigiously unfaithful to his wife and even to his friends' wives, fathomously libidinous, and superbly happy. Needless to say, this picture bears no more relation to the facts than a dissertation on major strategy by a military "expert" promoted from dramatic critic. If the chief suffragette scaremongers, I speak without any embarrassing naming of names, were attractive enough to men, to get near enough to men to know enough about them for their purpose, they would paralyze the Dorcas societies with no such cajoling libels. As a matter of sober fact, the average man of our time and race is quite incapable of all these incandescent and intriguing divertissements. He is far more virtuous than they make him out, far less schooled in sin, far less enterprising and ruthless. I do not say, of course, that he is pure in heart, for the chances are that he isn't. What I do say is that, in the overwhelming majority of cases, he is pure in act, and even in the face of temptation. And why? For several main reasons, not to go into minor ones. One is that he lacks the courage. Another is that he lacks the money. Another is that he is fundamentally moral and has a conscience. It takes more sinful initiative than he has in him to plunge into any affair save the most casual and sordid. It takes more ingenuity and intrepidity than he has in himself to carry it off. It takes more money than he can conceal from his consort to finance it. A man may force his actual wife to share the direst poverty, but even the least vampirish woman of the third part demands to be courted in what, considering his station in life, is the grand manner, and the expenses of that grand manner scare all off save a small minority of specialists in deception. So long, indeed, as a wife knows her husband's income accurately, she has a sure means of holding him to his oaths. Even more effective than the fiscal battery is the barrier of poltroonery. The one character that distinguishes man from the other highly vertebrata, indeed, is his excessive timorousness, his easy yielding to alarms, his incapacity for adventure without a crowd behind him. In his normal incarnation he is no more capable of initiating an extra-legal affair, at all events above the mawkish harmlessness of a flirting match with a cigar girl in a cafe, than he is of scaling the battlements of hell. He likes to think of himself doing it, just as he likes to think of himself leading a cavalry charge or climbing the Matterhorn. Often, indeed, his vanity leads him to imagine the thing done, and he admits by winks and blushes that he is a bad one. But at the bottom of all that tawdry pretense there is usually nothing more material than an oafish smirk at some disgusted shop-girl, or a scraping of shins under the table. Let any woman who is disquieted by reports of her husband's derelictions figure to herself how long it would have taken him to propose to her if left to his own enterprise, and let her ask herself if so pusillanimous a creature could be imagined in the role of Don Giovanni. Finally, there is his conscience, the accumulated sediment of ancestral faint-heartedness in countless generations, with vague religious fears and superstitions to leaven and mellow it. What? A conscience? Yes, dear friends, a conscience. That conscience may be imperfect, inept, unintelligent, brummagem. It may be indistinguishable at times from the mere fear that someone may be looking. It may be shot through with hypocrisy, stupidity, play-acting. But nevertheless, as consciences go in Christendom, it is generally entitled to the name, and it is always in action. A man, remember, is not a being in vacuo. He is the fruit and slave of the environment that bathes him. One cannot enter the House of Commons, the United States Senate, or a prison for felons without becoming, in some measure, a rascal. One cannot fall overboard without shipping water. One cannot pass through a modern university without carrying away scars. And, by the same token, one cannot live and have one's being in a modern democratic state, year in and year out, without falling, to some extent at least, under that moral obsession which is the hallmark of the mob-man set free. A citizen of such a state, his nose buried in Nietzsche, Man and Superman, and other such advanced literature, may caress himself with the notion that he is an immoralist, that his soul is full of soothing sin, that he has cut himself loose from the revelation of God. But all the while there is a part of him that remains a sound Christian, a moralist, a right-thinking and forward-looking man. And that part, in time of stress, asserts itself. It may not worry him on ordinary occasions. It may not stop him when he swears, or takes a nip of whiskey behind the door, or goes motoring on Sunday. It may even let him alone when he goes to a leg show. But the moment a concrete temptress rises before him, her nose snow-white, her lips rouged, her eyelashes drooping provokingly, the moment such an abandoned wench has at him, and his lack of ready funds begins to conspire with his lack of courage to assault and wobble him, at that precise moment his conscience flares into function, and so finishes his business. First he sees difficulty, then he sees danger, then he sees wrong. The result is that he slinks off in trepidation, and another vampire is baffled of her prey. It is, indeed, the secret scandal of Christendom, at least in the Protestant regions, that most men are faithful to their wives. You will travel a long way before you find a married man who admits that he is, but the facts are the facts, and I am surely not one to flout them. 36. The origin of a delusion. The origin of delusion that the average man is a Leopold II or Augustus the Strong, with the amorous experience of a guinea pig, is not far to seek. It lies in three factors, the which I rehearse briefly. 1. The idiotic vanity of men, leading to their eternal boasting either by open lying or sinister hints. 2. The notions of vice crusaders, nonconformist divines, YMCA secretaries, and other such libidinous poltroons as to what they would do themselves if they had the courage. 3. The ditto of certain suffragettes as to ditto. Here you have the genesis of a generalization that gives the less critical sort of woman a great deal of needless uneasiness and vastly augments the natural conceit of men. Some pornographic old fellow, in the discharge of his duties as director of an anti-vice society, puts in an evening plowing through such books as The Memoirs of Fanny Hill, Casanova's Confessions, The Sine Trichomonas of Gaius Petronius, and 2 Samuel. From this perusal he arises with the conviction that life amid the red lights must be one stupendous whirl of deviltry, that the clerk he sees in Broadway or Piccadilly at night are out for revels that would have caused protest in Sodom and Nineveh, that the average man who chooses hell leads an existence comparable to that of a Mormon bishop, that the world outside the Bible class is packed like a sardine can with brigade salesgirls, that every man who doesn't believe that Jonah swallowed the whale spends his whole leisure leaping through the seventh hoop of the Decalogue. Quote, "If I were not saved and anointed of God," end quote, whispers the vice director into his own ear, quote, "this is what I, the Reverend Dr. Jasper Barebones, would be doing. The late King David did it, he was a human, and hence immoral. The late King Edward VII was not beyond suspicion. The very numeral in his name has its suggestions. Millions of others go the same route, ergo, up guards and at 'em. Bring me the pad of blank warrants. Order out the searchlights and scaling ladders. Swear in 400 more policemen. Let to chase these hellhounds out of Christendom and make the world safe from monogamy, poor working girls, and infant damnation." End quote. Thus the hound of heaven, arguing fallaciously from his own secret aspirations. Where he makes his mistake is in assuming that the unconsecrated, while sharing his longing to debauch and to betray, are free from his other weaknesses. For example, his timidity, his lack of resourcefulness, his conscience. As I have said, they are not. The vast majority of those who appear in the public haunts of sin are there, not to engage in overt acts of ribaldry, but merely to tremble agreeably upon the edge of the abyss. They are the same skittish experimentalists precisely who throng the Midway at World's Fair, and go to smutty shows, and take in sex magazines, and read the sort of books that our vice-crusading friend reads. They like to conjure up the charms of carnality, and to help out their somewhat sluggish imaginations by actual peeps at it. But when it comes to taking a forthright header into the sulphur, they usually fail to muster up the courage. For one clerk who succumbed to the hours of the pave, there are 500 who succumb to lack of means, the warnings of the sex hygienists, and their own depressing consciences. For one clubman, that is, bagman or suburban vestryman, who invades the women's shops, engages the affection of some innocent miss, lures her into infamy, and then sells her to the Italians, there are 1,000 who never get any further than asking the price of cologne water and discharging a few furtive winks. And for one husband of the Nordic race who maintains the blonde chorus girl in Oriental luxury around the corner, there are 10,000 who are as true to their wives, year in and year out, as so many convicts in a death house, and would be no more capable of any such loathsome malpractice, even in the face of free opportunity, than they would be of cutting off the ears of their young. I am sorry to blow up so much romance. In particular, I am sorry for the suffragettes who specialize in the double standard. For when they get into pantaloons at last, and have the new freedom, they will discover to their sorrow that they have been pursuing a chimera, that there is really no such animal as the male anarchist they have been denouncing and envying, that the wholesale fornication of man, at least under Christian democracy, has little more actual existence than honest advertising or sound cooking. They have followed the pornomaniacs in embracing a piece of buncombe, and when the day of deliverance comes, it will turn to ashes in their arms. Their error, as I say, lies in overestimating the courage and enterprise of man. They themselves, barring mere physical valor, a quality in which the average man is far exceeded by the average jackal or wolf, have more of both. If the consequences to a man of the slightest descent from Virginia were 1/10 as swift and barbarous as the consequences to a young girl in like case, it would take a division of infantry to dredge up a single male flounder of that lex talionis in the whole western world. As things stand today, even with the odds so greatly in his favor, the average male hesitates and is thus not lost. Turn to the statistics of the vice crusaders if you doubt it. They show that the weekly receipts of female recruits upon the wharves of sin are always more than the demand, that more young women enter upon the vermilion career that can make a respectable living at it, that the pressure of the temptation they hold out is the chief factor in corrupting our undergraduates. What was the first act of the American army when it began summoning its young clerks and college boys and plowhands to conscription camps? Its first act was to mark off a so-called moral zone around each camp, and to secure it with trenches and machine guns, and to put a lot of volunteer termagants to patrolling it, that the assembled jeunesse might be protected in their rectitude from the immoral advances of the adjacent milkmaids and poor working girls. 37. Women as martyrs. I have given 3 reasons for the prosperity of the notion that man is a natural polygamist, bent eternally upon fresh dives into Lake of Brimstone number 7. To these another should be added, the thirst for martyrdom which shows itself in so many women, particularly under the higher forms of civilization. This unhealthy appetite, in fact, may be described as one of civilization's diseases. It is almost unheard of in more primitive societies. The savage woman, unprotected by her rude culture and forced to heavy and incessant labor, has retained her physical strength, and with it her honesty and self-respect. The civilized woman, gradually degenerated by a greater ease and helped down that hill by the pretensions of civilized man, has turned her infirmity into a virtue, and so affects a feebleness that is actually far beyond the reality. It is by this route that she can most effectively disarm masculine distrust and get what she wants. Man is flattered by any acknowledgment, however insincere, of his superior strength and capacity. He likes to be leaned upon, appealed to, followed docilely, and this tribute to his might caresses him on the psychic plane as well as on the plane of the obviously physical. He not only enjoys helping a woman over a gutter, he also enjoys helping her dry her tears. The result is the vast pretense that characterizes the relation of the sexes under civilization, the double pretense of man's cunning and autonomy and of woman's dependence and deference. Man is always looking for someone to boast to. Woman is always looking for a shoulder to put her head on. This feminine affectation, of course, has gradually taken on the force of a fixed habit, and so it has gotten certain support by a familiar process of self-delusion in reality. The civilized woman inherits that habit as she inherits her cunning. She is born half convinced that she is really as weak and helpless as she later pretends to be, and the prevailing folklore offers her endless corroboration. One of the resultant phenomena is the delight in martyrdom that one so often finds in women, and particularly in the least alert and introspective of them. They take a heavy, unhealthy pleasure in suffering. It subtly pleases them to be hard put upon. They like to picture themselves as slaughtered saints. Thus, they always find something to complain of. The very conditions of domestic life give them a superabundance of clinical material. And if, by any chance, such material shows a falling off, they are uneasy and unhappy. Let a woman have a husband whose conduct is not reasonably open to question, and she will invent mythical offenses to make him bearable. And if her invention fails, she will be plunged into the utmost misery and humiliation. This fact probably explains many mysterious divorces. The husband was not too bad, but too good. For public opinion among women, remember, does not favor the woman who is full of a placid contentment and has no masculine torch to report. If she says that her husband is wholly satisfactory, she is looked upon as a numbskull, even more dense than he is himself. A man, speaking of his wife to other men, always praises her extravagantly. Boasting about her soothes his vanity. He likes to stir up the envy of his fellows. But when two women talk of their husbands, it is mainly atrocities that they describe. The most esteemed woman gossip is the one with the longest and most various repertoire of complaints. This yearning for martyrdom explains one of the commonly noted characters of woman, their eager flair for bearing physical pain. As we have seen, they have actually a good deal less endurance than men. Massive injuries shock them more severely and kill them more quickly. But when acute algesia is unaccompanied by any profounder phenomena, they are undoubtedly able to bear it with a far greater show of resignation. The reason is not far to seek. In pain, a man sees only an invasion of his liberty, strength, and self-esteem. It floors him, masters him, and makes him ridiculous. But a woman, more subtle and devious in her processes of mind, senses the dramatic effect that the spectacle of her suffering makes upon the spectators, already filled with compassion for her feebleness. She would thus much rather be praised for facing pain with a martyr's fortitude than for devising some means of getting rid of it, the first thought of a man. No woman could have invented chloroform, nor for that matter alcohol. Both drugs offer an escape from situations and experiences that, even in aggravated forms, women relish. The woman who drinks as men drink, that is to raise her threshold of sensation and ease the agony of living, nearly always shows a deficiency in feminine characters and an undue preponderance of masculine characters. Almost invariably, you will find her vain and boastful, and full of other marks of that bombastic exhibitionism which is so sterlingly male. In Defense of Women by H. L. Mencken. 38.